Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our fall cycle of life groups and our Building for the Future series. Hope you've been having some great discussions in your groups and getting intentional about building the future of your life for the glory of God. Today, we're talking about building a life of faith. How many of you are believing for something in your life, trusting God for some breakthrough, some area of your life, maybe believing God for a financial breakthrough or freedom from anxiety or for a relationship to be restored, or maybe for a new job or a new career path, something like that. I think we're all believing God for something. And often what happens when we're trusting God for something, believing God for something, we inevitably hit these obstacles, these setbacks. God doesn't always seem to be answering our prayers on our timetable. But here's what I've learned. I've learned that God is at work even when we can't see it. And that's what we see in our story today. So for the past few weeks, we've been in the book of Joshua, looking at the story of Joshua and how he prepared to lead the Israelites into the promised land. They were standing on the brink of the promised land. God begins to speak to Joshua and tells him, move forward in faith. You're going to go take the promised land, and I'm going to be with you. And everywhere you go, everywhere you step foot, I'm going to give you that promised land. And so in this week's part of the story, we're in Joshua chapter 3. Joshua's about to embark on this journey, but he has an obstacle. Just like many of us face an obstacle, he has this obstacle between him and the promised land. This obstacle is called the Jordan River. And God begins to speak to him about moving forward and crossing this very first barrier to the promise that God has for him. And so we're talking about three things that we need to embrace for a breakthrough. Here's the first one. Number one is to position yourself. So three keys to trusting God for a breakthrough, to build a life of faith. You got to position yourself for the breakthrough. Here's what Joshua chapter 3, verse 7 through 8 says. And the Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of Israel, so that they may know I am with you as I was with Moses. In other words, your leadership profile is going to begin to rise before the people because they're going to see my hand upon you. Verse 8, he says, tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river. In other words, I'm about to do something. I'm about to part these waters and make a way for you, but you got to go stand in the river. You got to position yourself. You got to take a step. You got to move out. We got to hear the voice of God. Joshua didn't get ahead of God. He heard the voice of God and he followed the presence of God. He said, the ark is going to go before you. When you don't know what else to do, listen for the voice of God. Seek his voice, follow his presence. What are we going to do? We're trusting God for a breakthrough in our lives. Number two, we're going to step out in faith. Step out in faith. Verse 12 and 13, it says, now then, here's what Joshua tells the people. The Lord tells Joshua to tell the people, now then, choose 12 people from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. And as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. God tells Joshua, you're going to have to step out in faith. The priests are going to have to step out in faith. Wouldn't we love for it to work the opposite way? Like God's going to just cause the Jordan River to stop flowing, then we're going to step out. He says, no, I want you to actually go step into the Jordan, which was at flood stage, by the way. We learned it was at flood stage, swollen, raging river. He's like, nope, you got to take a step of faith. Often that's how it works. That's how faith works. God invites us to trust him, to step out in faith, to make the first move. And so you got to make the first move. You got to make the first counseling appointment. You got to apply to go back to school, apply for that new job, attack the smallest debt you have, take some step of faith, begin giving and trusting that God's going to make you a generous person and bless your finances. Take the first step of faith and God will meet you there. Here's the third thing. Well, if we're believing God for a breakthrough, number three, you got to stand on the promise. Stand on the promise. Here's what happens. It says, verse 14 through 16, when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan was at flood stage all during the harvest, yet as soon as the priests who carried the Ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, look at verse 16, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a great distance away at a town called Adam. We'll stop there. So about 20 miles away, the water stops flowing when the priest stepped out in faith. Now, think about this. Did they experience the miracle right away? No. There was several miles of rushing water that had to come by and pass the Israelites before it stopped flowing. The minute they stepped out in faith, they set the miracle into motion, but it was standing on the promise of God that brought the miracle to fruition. Let me just encourage you guys, there's going to be times when we step out in faith and we're not going to see the miracle right away. There's going to be times we step out in faith and it's going to get harder before it gets easier. And that's where we live in the tension. We live most of our days downstream, just getting up every day, praying, going to work, doing our chores, raising our kids, going to school, doing those things while we're praying, while we're trusting me. Can I just encourage you, while you're praying, God is working, even when you can't see it, even when you can't feel it. God is working behind the scenes of our lives upstream. And so hang in there, stand in the river, stand where God called you to go, and trust Him that eventually the miracle is going to get to you downstream. So that's what we do. We stand on God's promise because we trust that He has a process. So let's talk about it. Let's talk faith to each other. Let's talk about building a life of faith, trusting God for a breakthrough in our lives. I'm praying you have a great discussion.